Hello, everyone, and welcome to another interview, this time with Auron MacIntyre. I hope I'm saying that right. He'll correct me in a minute, but first I'm going to give him an introduction. Yeah, I've been watching Auron's videos for a while now, and I was surprised to find that you were following me on Twitter. And I'd like to just introduce you and your ideas to the people watching my channel. It's not that I agree with everything you say or follow, your political philosophy, but I definitely find your videos interesting, and you seem to be a very intellectually curious, honest person. You're not fully committed to one idea, and you're not too zealous about your ideas, which is what I really appreciate. And you're part of. Would you think it's fair to say that you're part of the neo-reactionary or NRX political movement?
Yeah, as much as that is a political movement, I think that's fair. I would say it's less of a political movement and more of a kind of understanding of political theory. Like there aren't neo-reactionary political parties getting ready to run neo-reactionary political candidates. You know what I mean?
Sure.
It's more of a way of kind of analyzing politics that a number of people have kind of picked up over the years. And so we do kind of tend to have a few people who talk about it. And so, we get referred to that way. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, that's all I meant by movement. I mean, a genre of YouTube video, as far as I'm concerned. I don't really read blogs or, I should really read more books than I do, but most of my political content is streamed through YouTube. So that's how I sort of define movement in my own opinion. And I first heard about the neo-reactionaries through the context of Mencius Moldbug and the Cathedral seem to be the biggest sort of terms associated with the theory, political theory. Is that fair?
Yeah, those are definitely the Mencius Moldbug. Curtis Yarvin is his real name, but he wrote under Mencius Moldbug originally, so that's what a lot of people know him by, and he's definitely probably the most prominent figure, most prominent kind of theorist in neo-reaction, and the Cathedral is probably the concept that has been most widely used. You can even actually catch a couple of Fox News hosts using it incorrectly now. So it has gained a wider kind of consciousness. So yeah, I would think that those would definitely be the two most identifiable things about neo-reaction, probably.
Okay. I think it would be beneficial for my audience. I know you've talked about it a lot, and I can just point to your videos. But if you could sum up the theory of the Cathedral, what that term means, I'll give you enough space to do it. But if you could keep it to less than about 5 minutes, that would be
Sure.
be preferable.
Sure. So obviously, when you look at the term neo-reactionary, you've got two parts there. You've got reactionary, which is people who it's kind of come to mean your classic reactionaries were people like Joseph de Maistre or Thomas Carlyle, and they were people who were looking at the Enlightenment and saying, okay, a lot of people are very excited about the Enlightenment and liberal democracy and all the advances that this could bring, but there's also going to be some downsides. There's going to be some consequences to this, and a lot of people aren't paying enough attention to kind of what that means. And so the neo part of neo-reactionary thinking is really people taking some of those older understandings of politics and kind of updating them and saying, do these things still apply? Like, did humanity really completely change after the Enlightenment? Did the political realities completely change? Or are many of those things that we think, disappeared in the 1300s or the 1500s, are those forces that are still at work in society today? And so what the concept of the cathedral is the cathedral is the decentralized consensus-making apparatus of our culture. And what that really means is it's what informs the ideas that most of us carry around in our head and kind of the way we have an outlook on the world and the way politics functions. If you were back in the 1500s or the 1300s or whatever, what would have dictated your morality? What would have dictated your understanding between other human beings, how you interacted with them? What would have defined almost all of that? Well, it would have been kind of your church, right? That's what it would have been, that mediating uh, uh, institution that had defined the way people interacted at that time. And if we look today, a lot of people will say, okay, well, the church is gone, or it's no longer as relevant anymore, and we don't really interact that way anymore. Religion doesn't dictate this stuff anymore. But what the cathedral model does is it looks at our different institutions that impact the way people think and the way people talk about politics and culture and those kind of things. And what are those different institutions? Well, one is going to be obviously the media, both news and entertainment. Another major one is going to be your university system, because of course anybody who is in media almost uniformly has gone to a university, right? They're going to be informed by this. And then also it tends to be the non-elected bureaucracy, especially here in the United States. Of course, we're talking about like the State Department and that kind of thing. People who are part of the government and inform the policy of the government, but are never directly elected on. And what the theory of the cathedral kind of posits is that even though these are all different, separate uh, institutions, because they tend to all share the same outlook on life, because they all have the same beliefs about morality and the way people should interact, because the colleges, the professors, they are the ones that educate all of these people who end up in these positions of power, and they all tend to go to the same, cocktail parties, and they read the same New Yorker articles. What they really have is their own insular culture. And so if we look at America specifically, but even the world, different countries worldwide, we can see that what we have is a very particular elite culture that is built into these institutions. And what those elites do is they share the same beliefs and the same values, and they end up then distributing those values through these different institutions of media and education, government, down to the people they rule over. And so what we see with the cathedral is really basically a decentralized atheistic theocracy. It's a group of people who don't have one central book, right? One central church that they go to. So it's harder for us to see because it's not the Catholic Church with the Pope, but it still nevertheless creates a cultural consensus. And that cultural consensus is then what informs and guides our political discussion. It's what creates the Overton window in which we all have those kinds of discussions, and that drives the majority of politics in the Western world, in the Anglosphere.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you very much. That was very eloquently put. And I wonder if you've read Thomas Sowell's book, Intellectuals and Society, which is a sort of similar theory, but I don't know exactly how it differs from this cathedral theory, if it does.
No, Sowell has pieces of it, and don't get me wrong. This idea of cultural hegemony by institutions is not unique to Yarvin. He's not the first. Moldbug's not the first person to notice that elites influence culture. In fact, if you look back at many of the older reactionary political scientists and philosophers, guys like James Burnham, guys like Prato, guys like Mosca, they all talk about how elites are the main influencers of culture. And so I think that Sowell definitely has a piece of that in his book. I've read a number of Sowell books, though I have not completely read that one, so I wouldn't be able to parse every bit. I know he doesn't agree with Yarvin 100% on that. I know it's not the same theory, but there's a Venn diagram there where they overlap, absolutely.
Yeah, and I just wanted to clarify, because when I first heard about the cathedral and Moldbug, for some reason, maybe it was just because of the people who were saying it, I was under the impression that it was kind of a conspiracy theory. The difference between a conspiracy and the kind of what you're talking about is the the idea that there were people who were sort of meeting in secret who would decide on what the consensus would be, and maliciously perhaps. But the cathedral doesn't require people to this consensus to be arrived at intentionally, or by groups of people who are manipulating things on purpose. It's just just correct me if I'm wrong, but it's just the outcome that happens when you get a lot of people who agree with each other, who form a kind of echo chamber, and who have a lot of influencing, what you might call soft power, to encourage a certain kind of worldview.
Yeah, absolutely, and that's a big thing that makes the cathedral so powerful. So there'd be nothing unique about someone saying like, "Hey, out there, there's some cabal of people running the world," right? Like anybody, a million people have that theory. Like, so there's nothing novel about that. And it's very easy for people to lapse into the use of the phrase "the cathedral." To do that, I have noticed that quite a bit. That the more the cathedral becomes a more mainstream idea, especially on the right, it actually just comes to mean like Illuminati, which is not at all what the cathedral is about.
Mm.
So it's definitely important for people to understand that, yeah, you're not just talking about like a bunch of people who get together to rule that. What it really is about is, like you said, soft power, and that's something that's really difficult for us to think about a lot of times, because especially the American context of understanding the way government power works is we say, okay, there is this formal government structure, and we have this great constitution, because what it does is it breaks up this formal government power into three branches, and each branch checks and balances each other, and so they control each other's power. No one part gets too strong, and so this will contain government power, right? Because we can all see it out in the open, it's formal. But the cathedral is not really built on formal power. It's built on informal power. And informal power are the powers that we don't declare openly that are in charge. So, you can look at things like the media, and you can see very obviously that they drive a large amount of government decisions. But why do they do that? They don't have any formal power, right? There's nothing that says they are the fourth branch of government and they get to veto Congress, but their influence is incredibly high, higher than any given congressman or senator, maybe even any president, definitely any president in my opinion. But we can see that that power is soft power. It exists outside of the formal structure. And so one of the great things about the cathedral, one of the things that gives it the power that it has and the resilience it has, is that it's very hard to hold accountable, right? Like if there's a president and he does a bad job, you vote him out of office. That's accountability. But for the cathedral, because it is decentralized, because there is no one person, no pope, no king, no president handing down orders, there's no official flow of power from the cathedral. That means that it is in no way impacted by things like elections, because you're not electing any people in the cathedral. When did you vote for the World Economic Forum, right? Like when did you vote for Hope Not Hate, or the Anti-Defamation League? Like when did you vote for Bill Gates to run COVID policy? You didn't. But it doesn't matter. The power is still real, even if it's informal. And because there's no central control, there's no place at which you can actually focus accountability, which only makes the power more resilient.
Okay, thanks. I've got a difficult question for you, and I hope you don't take this as an accusation. But a lot of what this theory sounds like, it's often, well, I shouldn't say this, but there are perhaps a minority of people who have a very similar theory about how soft power and hard power, and who's really in charge. But it's very much an anti-Semitic kind of theory, where the people who hold this soft power happen to be Jewish. For instance, I mean, it's very much an American phenomenon, I think. But do you have any reaction to that, or any defense of that?
Sure, sure. So, first, I don't think it's an American reaction. Actually, funny enough, I see it more in Europe than anything else. But maybe that's just us looking at each other's
I
pond,
guess,
I
yeah.
guess. But no, I mean, Curtis Yarvin is himself Jewish, right? And I don't. I know there are many people who hold those, suspicions on the fringes or something, but that is not in any way, in my opinion, what neo-reaction is about. That's in fact the opposite. The entire point of the theory is that you don't need that, right? Is that you do not need that conspiracy. You do not need that cabal. Uh, it doesn't mean that there aren't bad actors out there. I guess individuals, George Soros isn't a great guy, but that doesn't. I don't think that indicates a wider, conspiracy, and I don't think that's part of the cathedral theory in itself.
Okay, thanks. I just wanted to give you the platform to explicitly. I mean, it's a shame that we have to do this, but I didn't want anyone who's new to this theory to get the wrong idea. As I did, like I said, when I first heard about the cathedral, it sounded like a kind of like a racist conspiracy theory almost. Just I don't know why I made that association in my head. Uh,
Well,
that was
because
not
you're
great for me.
informed too, right? Like, and I'm just saying, like, there's a reason that those archetypes fall into a specific area outside the Overton window. Because if you can lump things together, then people won't actually critically look at them. I
Yeah,
guess is
yeah,
my thought. But
yeah. I think I was. I can't remember if it was an old video or a new video that you made. But I was going through some of your old library in preparation for this interview, and I really liked what you said. Now I'm even wondering if it was you. It was in one of your videos, but I think you said something about how what do you call it? The being able to manipulate the optics of the opposition when
mm-hmm.
because the cathedral holds the frame, they can make any opposition to the cathedral look like racism or fascism, anything.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. And this Yarvin talks about this quite a bit, actually. It's, don't inhabit the frame of your enemy. One of the problems we have is that when there's a group of, a class of people who inform uh, the basically the political reality of our institutions, they not only define what is the good and the approved message, but they also define people's conception of the opposite. And so if, and Yarvin uses this example all the time, if a 15-year-old kid looks around and sees all the horrible, like, social justice destruction of their culture and says, okay, I don't like this. This is garbage. What's the opposite of this? Well, what does every guidance counselor in, like, middle school tell that kid? Oh, the opposite is the Nazis, right? It's Hitler. Like, that's fascism. And so what that does is that it's like an anchoring point, right? Like, the only conception that person has of opposition to what is being presented to them is something that is being projected onto them. And this serves a lot of purposes. First, it makes opposition to these ideas almost impossible, but it also means that anyone who does oppose them is basically almost always going to walk into a trap, which turns them into the enemy that the kind of the institutions want, that the cathedral wants, right? They want these people to turn into horrible, anti-Semitic conspiracy theorists. Like, that is the kind of person they're trying to tell everybody is always lurking in the shadows. And so the ideology almost manufactures those as the only viable opposition to the ideas being presented, which is incredibly useful.
Yeah, and that brings me nicely to my next line of questioning, which is about the call to action or the lack thereof of the neo-reactionists, which is I think you've called it the clear pill. Everything's got a pill these days, right? So
Yes, yeah.
if we had to call it a pill, that's the name for it. It's transparent in the sense that it's that you should do nothing because you don't because it just plays into this negative framing uh, as you described. Is that right?
The clear pill is something that Yarvin kind of floated, and it's something that I'm still thinking a lot about because I think he has a lot of very good points inside of it, like the ones we just talked about how opposition, the further you struggle into the trap, the more you're trapped, right? And Nick Land, one of the other guys who's very influential on neo-reactionary thought, also has a great bit about this in one of his essays of the opposition basically being structured to defeat you. Like, just by simply trying to organize opposition, you actually end up becoming what these people want, and so there's a problem with that. Yarvin basically says, look, you need to act like an expat in your own country. Like, you need to remove yourself emotionally from the scenario, because anytime you get emotional, you're just going to feed into the energy. Like, basically, these people, the kind of progressives that are running society, they need you to get emotionally opposed to them in order to make a fight of it. Like, nobody cares about a fight where one person just pummels the other one to death. Like, you need a real opponent, or at least someone you can cast as a real opponent, in order to like claim victory. And that's what these narratives need. They need a victory every once in a while to show, like, look, you still really need us to strike down these evil people who are hiding in the shadows. And if they don't have those people, they'll go out and find them. And so Yarvin really counsels people to say, look, you can't, the way the system is set up, political opposition does not actually change anything. The people who control these forces have set, especially democracy, because they inform the opinions of people through these institutions. Democracy is not a viable route of change, because they control any framing that you would bring to the discussion. And so the best thing you can do is really bring things down to a personal and local level. Better yourself, better your family, better your community, and kind of, you become worthy by doing that, because at some point this all has to collapse. Like, at some point this edifice has to fall down. And when it does, people will want to look elsewhere, and the people they're going to look for are the people who are going to kind of have their lives together, and people whose ideologies and beliefs are working properly in the real world. But as it is right now, bringing like classic, like, going out and protesting, or sending the Proud Boys out to fight Antifa, like, there is not going to be a win for the right on there. There's no instance in which someone goes out and fights Antifa, and then they get framed as the good guys in the paper tomorrow. It simply doesn't happen. And so there's no reason to go out there and put yourself in danger and feed these people the enemies that they want to have.
Yeah, I think there's a lot that's very sensible about that, and it feeds into a lot of Jordan Peterson's, I want to call it rhetoric, but that has a negative connotation, but a lot of what he's been saying about, clean your room, sort yourself out. And there's, I've seen how much good that can do to the people around you, to have this sort of rock of the community that they can rely on. You can probably do a lot more good that way than, like you said, getting yourself in trouble. And I don't think it's very psychologically healthy to be too riled up about politics. But then there is also another part of me that thinks that is, to take the clear pill, to take yourself out of, out of any emotional investment at all. It seems defeatist. I suppose that's probably the biggest criticism of that theory. The idea that I shouldn't try to get interested in politics. It's often a shame that the people who involve themselves in formal politics, the people who run the local council, or I don't know what the American equivalent is, like you were saying, state officials, and I always think about the people in Parks and Recreation. That's my only point of reference for American local government.
It's very accurate, so it's a good reference. Yeah.
Well, the only people who get involved like that, they tend to be busybodies, people who are like far too nosy about other people's business, authoritarians, and then the people who just want to chill out and what's that meme that got popular recently? But the guy who just wants to grill, the guy who just wants to have a barbecue. The people who are just getting on with it, they never get involved in government. And I know that's not quite the same as getting involved with this sort of soft power, the cathedral. I don't know where I'm going with this, but it is defeatist, isn't it?
Well, I understand that concern, and I think that is my concern too. And so I tend to strike a balance because this is also something that a lot of people had a criticism of Jordan Peterson for, right? Like, I think his advice is excellent for individuals, and I agree with it, and it's actually helped me out through difficult times. So I'm a big fan of his. But at the same time, the one problem with Peterson's philosophy is it doesn't address the larger societal issue, right? And he's right to say, like, at some point there's only the main agency you have is just to yourself, and that's where you should focus it, because that's where the majority of influence and positive steps can be taken, and that's absolutely true. But at some point you can't just care about yourself, and at some point taking care of your community means involving yourself in politics, right? Like, if you there are unfortunately, government has now grown to the point where there is no place to run. Like, there is no, in neo-reactionary circles we call exit. There is no way to exit at this point. You are there. The government is too big. It reaches into too many parts of your life. So it's not like you can just like break off and do your own thing and you'll be fine. Like, no, they're gonna like, force this stuff on your kids and your family and your neighbors. And so the just completely, doing your own thing and just bettering yourself and your family doesn't work entirely. So I do understand that concern. I think that maybe the best understanding of it the one that I think of personally is to understand that the battlefield is not primarily formally political, that the people who are visiting this kind of stuff on you are not really your governments. For instance, lockdowns, and I know they vary wildly in the United States. Some states barely have them at all, and some states that you can't leave your house at all. And I know the UK has more restrictive ones too, but the lockdowns aren't largely visited on you by the government. Yes, they are the end enforcement mechanism. Like, they are the final people who will go in and force you, to comply with them if you actually break the law. But the vast majority of this is brought to you by the media, right? And in educational institutions, these kind of things. And so the battlefield on this kind of stuff is really far more in those soft power areas. And by growing yourself and growing your influence inside your community, you are more likely to impact those institutions than I think you are to like formally make meaningful changes in direct government.
Okay, well, what do you think about something? Well, you obviously started a YouTube channel, and that's been going well for you. And I wonder how much influence you think a good YouTube channel can have. I mean, obviously it depends on how many people are viewing it and whether YouTube allows you to, game the algorithm or not. But if say you are successful, maybe you're a Sargon of Akkad, how much does that count as soft power? And are you just becoming the Alex Jones, the fascist that they all want to fight? Do you think Sargon of Akkad's doing the right thing, for instance?
Yeah, I know he catches a lot of flack, but I think he's probably doing the most of almost anyone kind of in that sphere. He's not a neo-reactionary, but just anyone kind of in the. I hesitate to even call it right, because so many people are so they don't like the term, or they don't see themselves on the right, but people who oppose progressivism maybe
Right.
is the best way to phrase it. Like, of those people, he probably is doing the most. Not only does he bring a large amount of influence due to his successful YouTube channel, but the most important thing, the thing that I've really liked to see him do recently, is him building formal organizations. The entrance into formal politics didn't go anywhere, but I didn't expect it to. But I think the things that are really meaningful is that he's building these media organizations and expanding the reach and influence of those things kind of into the deeper cultural pattern. And so I think that those are positive steps. Are they 100% aligned with everything I think? No, but that I don't need them to be, right? Like, I think that is a positive step for him to take, and I think that the more of that we see, the better. Now, I don't think that YouTube channels on their own can really do everything we want them to do for the very reasons you said, right? Like, they're not going to let another person become Sargon on YouTube. That's never going to happen again. They'll never let that happen again. Um, but so there is an uphill battle there, and there's only so much we can do online. One of the upsides of online is it lets people like you and I, who never would have ran into each other or had a conversation in real life, but are interested in kind of what each other are doing in the sphere, we can have this conversation, which is great. But at the same time, then all we can really do is take it back to our localities, right? Because at the end of the day, you and I can't team up to change anything in any real capacity, other than hoping to inspire other people and give them the tools they need to make those changes in a more local and more real situation.
Well, that's what we're doing right now, right? Is that we're
Right.
teaming up
Right.
and we're spreading the good news, as the Christians would say.
Indeed.
The thought did occur to me that the opposition to lockdowns, at least in the UK, seems to be pretty pronounced. I think a lot of people are just sick of it. People who were initially supportive are just tired of not seeing their family, and the impact of loneliness and social separation, it does build and it becomes exhausting, I think. And I started to wonder what it would take for everyone to stop doing it, to just see their friends and to meet in public, and there aren't enough policemen to to enforce the rules. But ultimately, it's what the police can do quite easily is to make sure that the businesses stay closed, the ones that are supposed to be closed. And so I mean that is what it comes down to. It's I don't know if you read or watched Game of Thrones, but it's the riddle that is posed by, I think, Varys, about who holds the power in a room where there's I can't even remember, it's the monarch and the assassin and the head of the religion,
like the merchant,
the merchant or the pope or whatever. And it's he doesn't pose an actual solution to it, except that whoever the bodyguard, the guy who's holding the sword, who's going to swing the sword, whoever he listens to is the one who's really in charge, or maybe he's in charge. And in the modern world, that is often the police. And so they're controlled by the government, but as you say, the government is controlled by the media and the people to some extent. Have I got that about right?
Yeah. So I think what might be useful here is something that you can get from again, James Burnham, who's somebody who had a big influence on Curtis Yarvin, on Mencius Moldbug, and his understanding of power. And what he does is he kind of takes and looks at Machiavelli's lions and Machiavelli's foxes. And Machiavelli's famous political theorist, wrote The Prince. And one of the things that he talks about is that there are basically two types of people in the ruling class, and one is a lion and one is a fox. And the lions are kind of what we think of when we think of old school traditional leadership, right? They're the monarch. They're the patriotic soldiers who lead into battle and crush the enemy and defend the homeland, and they rule primarily through duty and force. And those are what you see at the beginning of most societies, is they tend to be dominated by lions, because that's what you need to really create a society. You need someone to kind of cut your country out of the land and defend its borders and create order. And that's what you get at the beginning. And then you tend to start to see the rise of the foxes later on in the life of the civilization. And the reason you see foxes rise up is that they tend to be people who are more mentally agile. They're more willing, they're less connected to tradition and religiosity and family, and tend to be more willing to mix and bring in different ideas. And this makes them more and more valuable as the civilization grows, because the civilization starts encountering problems that are less physical and existential, directly, direct threat of violence. And it tends to start facing problems that are more intellectual. And so what happens is you start to see the shift towards the foxes. And it's not to say that one or the other is like the only person who should rule. You do want to see a mixture of foxes and lions. But what happens as society ages is you start to see more and more foxes come to power. You start to see the need for the lions wane and kind of a distaste for them. They start to become, the society forgets why it really needed them in the first place because the foxes have offered them so much for so long, and they tend to start selecting only foxes to rule. Now, the upside again for the foxes is that they are willing to go out and think of new ways to do things and bring innovation. But because they are so disconnected from what it took to build the country originally, they become really uncomfortable with a lot of those things, and especially things like the use of force. Because as uncomfortable as it can be for modern people and democracies, we often forget that we are all ruled by force at the end of the day. That is what actually generates sovereignty in a country. And that's obviously very clear when you have like a king, right? Because he's got direct control of the army and what he says goes, and it's very clear. But when you're ruled by foxes, you usually have to be ruled by a number of levels of abstractions. No, you're not directly under force. You vote for your leaders, and you're in charge. You have the sovereignty, and they just listen to what you say. But anybody who like decides they're not going to pay taxes quickly finds out that's not true. And so what we see is that as society shifts towards these foxes who are less comfortable with the use of force, the way they rule becomes weird and fuzzy because they don't like to use force. And when they do have to eventually use force because people stop listening to them, they use it in a really weird and arbitrary way, which can actually like be far crueler than lions who would just use it directly because they're not afraid of it. And so when we're looking at these lockdowns, I think you're seeing a lot of fox application of power. Like they have the sword because they control the state. And of course, the police are the actual, monopoly on violence. They're the actual sword of the state. But they don't know how to wield it. And so you see these really, again, I tend to have more America-centric examples because that's where I live. But they tend, in America, we have a very arbitrary applications of these rules. They'll go and lock down a church, but then you can burn down a city if you feel like it, right?
Right.
And so it becomes very clearly arbitrary. It becomes, people start to lose faith in the application of force. And that's when your government's really in trouble. Like when people are no longer, when there's a consensus opinion among the majority of the people in your country that force being applied is unjust and arbitrary, that's when society really starts breaking down. And so will people push back hard enough to where the arbitrary of that force becomes so clear that like things go pear-shaped? It's anybody's guess, right? Like that's hard to know how far these governments will take it because this is, again, largely enforced at the whim of these people without a lot of, backing from the population. And the more they push their power that way, the more precarious things get.
Right. And I'm just reminded of the example that Thomas Sowell uses in Intellectuals in Society. When I guess I was just sort of thinking about this difference between lions and foxes is the rise of Winston Churchill to become prime minister after he was ridiculed by many, probably in the media, for saying that he was a warmonger and he was crazy for wanting to stop Hitler while he was still rising to power, and because a lot of people were just so appalled by the horrors of World War One that they could not, they mentally resisted the idea of a Second World War as much as they could. And do you think that's an apt application of the metaphor?
Yeah, absolutely. And you'll see this, you'll see there's still those last gasps of a functional, what we call circulation of elites, because you are always ruled by a set of elites. There are always people in charge. And a healthy society will have a circulation of those elites. They'll allow the best to kind of come in and deliver new blood and new ideas, and they'll allow things to wax and wane depending on what society needs instead of just the interest of the elites. Because what you want, as much as possible, is the interest of your elites as closely tied to your people as possible, so that everybody benefits. And so a society that still has that will allow someone like Churchill to come forward when he's needed, right?
I mean,
But
he's a lion, right? That's what I was getting at.
exactly,
Yeah.
yes, yeah, exactly. They'll allow a lion to return to power. But what we're seeing, I think, is that you don't get Churchills very much anymore in the West, right? And then I think the reason is we are less and less willing to let a lion come to the forefront. Anytime when someone vaguely like one comes around, we start getting, Trump is not a lion really, but he's the closest thing we've seen in a long time. And automatically, of course, we get Orange Hitler comparisons, right? And so that makes it harder and harder to return to that model of leadership when you really need it. And every society does need it at some point.
Well, something similar has been happening. Maybe you're not aware, but of course, Winston Churchill is widely celebrated in the UK, and for good reason, I think, and has been since World War II. But then recently, we have been seeing more suspicion of his of the extent to which we celebrate him, and now people will slyly, smugly bring up things like the famine in India and blame that on him, and accuse him of genocide in South Africa, and they're trying to make him into a kind of pseudo Orange Hitler, I guess. But that's one of those things where I wonder if they've just pushed it too hard, and whether people will really accept this new way of seeing Winston Churchill and to stop celebrating him. I mean, there is a question of whether it's wise to do this sort of hero worship thing. I mean, in America, correct me if I'm wrong, but George Washington has reached this sort of mythical status where fact is mixed with fiction to make this kind of half real, half fictional hero in history.
Yeah, well, so there's a couple of things you can look at there. So, for instance, we have a very similar process going on in America right now because they were tearing down statues all across America.
Yeah, exactly.
Right?
Yeah,
and it started with Confederate generals. What a lot of people don't understand, if you're not familiar really with the American Civil War and what it meant to people, is, while of course most people will focus on the slavery, and understandably so, of the South, there was a long battle between North and South over basically cultural identity. And so when the North ended up winning and reconstituting the United States by reabsorbing the South, one of the reasons that things were able to really hold together is that they were willing to let Southern soldiers have their honor. And that's not uniform. Like, there were awful things that happened during the Reconstruction. But because they were allowed to basically still see themselves as part of the American story, it still held together as a country. And now you're seeing, obviously, not just the Confederate statues going down. A lot of people were like, oh, well, it was just guys who were fighting for slavery, so that's fine. But now they're tearing down, statues of Abraham Lincoln, the guy who, fought the Civil War on the Union side, the president who reunited the United States and was supposed to be the hero of the anti-slavery movement, because of course he wasn't woke enough. Like, he said some things about black people that would be unbecoming today, and so he has to go too. And so really what you're seeing is just the decimation of anyone who has any of these traits, right? Like, anything left of this. And I think we do need hero worship. I think you absolutely do need that in a society, because that's what binds it together. Like, there is no such thing as pure historical fact, right? Like, anybody who's familiar with how history actually gets done knows that a large amount of history has always been kind of, has a foot firmly based in myth. And that's actually healthy for society, because what that does is creates kind of a chain of culture that binds your country together. And so when people are trying to destroy the myth of Churchill or the myth of of Lincoln or the myth of Washington, they really are directly coming at the culture that binds your country together. Whether they're correcting every fact or not, it really doesn't matter. That's not, I think, their goal at the end. Like, they're not just looking to get the exact number of correct facts that add up. That was never the goal in the first place. And so if they start changing the backstory to fit their narrative, no one should be surprised.
Yeah, and I totally get that. I think that it's not like the new facts that they're replacing the old legends with are going to be any more factually correct, or more with more integrity. They're just going to replace the half truths and fictions with their own half truths and fictions. But at the same time, there is something that rubs me the wrong way about anything that's sort of ahistorical, and maybe that's being too what's the word? Not being pragmatic enough, and it's an unattainable standard. But I do wonder whether this need for a sort of hero worship was once served by religion, where we could all agree that Jesus was a perfect man and everything he did was perfect, and he never said any oopsies that wouldn't be. Well, I guess he kind of did, but that I wonder if our suspicion about religion as a sort of modern secular society, whether that brings up this need to make George Washington into a hero, or to make Winston Churchill into a hero, when we had these perfectly, arguably fully mythical figures who we could have been worshipping.
Well, I mean, I know that you're familiar with Paul Vanderklay because that's how I found your channel.
Oh, really? Okay.
Yeah, so we both had discussions with Paul Vanderklay. So you're probably familiar with some of his work.
Yeah.
And the trick is ever believing that we ever escaped religion, right? Like, this is probably the core neo-reactionary realization above anything else. Is the Enlightenment didn't do the trick that we wanted it to do. It didn't actually just make us super rational computers. And actually, treating ourselves that way is dangerous and has a lot of consequences. And so, because we are beings that require narratives or memes or however you want to phrase it, whether you're more comfortable with Dawkins or whoever, it's all the same thing, right? We require these forms, we require these narratives, we require these memes. We need them to construct our lives. We are not purely rational creatures, and we don't exist that way. And the drive to create purely rational creatures is as destructive as anything else. And we never abandon them, which is kind of part of the central core of the Cathedral thesis, right? Is we didn't get rid of Christianity. It's not that our rulers no longer tell us what to think, like they did back when, the king told you which church you prayed to and you were part of Catholic or Eastern Orthodox or whatever. Like, that never went away. All of those forces are still in play today. We simply rationalize them differently. And that doesn't mean they're one-to-one. Like, every aspect of progressivism isn't a one-to-one to like classical Christianity or Islam or whatever. But they fulfill very similar functions. And we blind ourselves when we don't understand that as part of the human experience. Like, when we don't realize that our actions are informed by that, and that something is going to fill that void no matter what, then we are open to ideological possession because we think we've advanced beyond a basic human need that never went away.
Yeah, I think you're completely right about that, and I do enjoy exploring that side of religion, especially the last few years, and watching Paul Vanderklay's videos and getting to talk to him has been a great experience for me for that reason, is to sort of explore that side of that way of thinking about religion. I guess what I'm arguing is that like you said, we've always been religious, and perhaps this idea that we, like I said about the Enlightenment, maybe our hero worship of real historical figures was maybe the first signs that we were trying to depart from classical Christianity and falling into a kind of secular religion of hero worship. Although I think arguably the most ancient literature that we have of the ancient Greeks and Romans, they did kind of have their religion, if you could even, I suppose, yeah, you can call it that, can't you? It's weird to think of it now, the way that we have religion, but their stories were about heroes who were real people who they believed fought in real wars, or that's my interpretation of the Odyssey and the Iliad. Anyway, is that their gods, their heroes, were historical figures to them, and maybe they were based on real historical figures. I'm just going off on a rant. I don't know if you have anything to say about that.
No, there's quite a bit of good here. So I don't know if you're familiar with this, but America has a city called Cincinnati, right?
Yeah, yeah.
And that's named after George Washington. And the reason they named a city after George Washington Cincinnati is he embodies the ancient story of Cincinnatus, right? The Roman king who he became a dictator, or I should say, he became the dictator because they
always
needed
had a
him. Well, so the Roman system, they had the two consuls, but in a time of war or desperation, they had a legal office of dictator, right? That you would be that will be vested all of the power. And the trick was at like after I think it's 6 months, you would have to give it away. And the story of Cincinnatus is that he was given this power and he won the war and defended the Rome, and everybody wanted him to be king. They said, okay, please just be our king. And he said no. And he walked away and went back to the farm, right? Yeah. Because that's not what Rome does. And who knows the total level of historicity of that story, but the impact of that story is so great that thousands of years later, George Washington embodied that symbol by, after 2 terms, stepping away from the office in America of president and basically refusing a crown himself, that they then named a city in his honor in the mode of Cincinnatus, right? So that version of religiosity is super ancient and goes all the way past the Enlightenment, and I think is superhuman. And I don't think that the idea of separation of like religion and other things, like a secular and religious space, is itself actually very post-Christian, right? It's informed much more by Christianity than anything else. The Romans wouldn't have seen a large differentiation between historical myth and possible religious observance, right?
Yeah.
And that's more of a construction of ours than it is of theirs. And so when we say, oh, well, the worship of these historical figures could stand in for religion, I think it's just part of it. I think it's the part of it that's always been there. It's always part of the spiritual life.
Yeah, that's interesting. Thanks for that. Something that just came to mind is that I only recently started to think seriously about the founders of America. For them, Rome was almost it's as ancient to them as it is to us today, and they had a kind of the same kind of reverence for the classics that for ancient Rome that would be, I don't know what you call it. I just heard someone recently saying that it was that they were LARPing, live action role playing. They were when they created the United States, they were they thought it would be a great lark to try and be Romans and to have this constitution and to try and use their knowledge of ancient civilizations to create the sort of perfect I don't want to say society, but the perfect mode of having government. Although they didn't actually use the Cincinnatus rule, they did have the term rules. I really don't know much about your
Actually,
country.
the
I'd like to know
term
more.
rules are relatively new. They were added after FDR got 4 terms in a row during World War II.
Well, just the idea of having a term, I don't know how ancient that idea is. I mean, that's probably English Parliament, right?
It's Roman.
Really?
The Romans had there were 2 consuls for the year, and they elected 2 consuls every year. So the term in office goes all the way back to the beginning of republics.
Yeah, every year is an election year for the patricians, at least.
Yeah.
Okay, and And what about you? Are you interested in? Well, it sounds like you know a lot, but maybe that's just you're more educated than I am. Are you interested in ancient civilizations and the Romans?
Yeah, no, I definitely enjoy history quite a bit. I wouldn't put myself out there as any form of expert, but it is something that I when I read, my reading time is basically divided between history and political theory,
Hmm.
because I'm really cool, and so those are the two things that when I read. So I don't have a degree in history. I wouldn't put myself out there as an expert, but it's something I really enjoy learning about, and I do read quite a bit about.
Hmm. Well, to be honest, as we've been talking about, I don't value a degree in history much more than a long experience of reading historical literature. I mean, I wouldn't call you a historian, but I wouldn't automatically assume that anyone who has a PhD in history is an expert either. I mean, I don't know how much you're comfortable with sharing your personal life, but are you university educated in some subject, and what's your feeling about universities in general?
Yeah, so I definitely come from my degree's in political science. I study politics, and that's where the majority of my focus has been. I worked in kind of in American politics at lower levels, and then I was a reporter. I worked in the media, and was a reporter, a political reporter for a newspaper. Um, I think that there is, of course, a lot of value in education, but I think the modern university system is a disaster for a lot of reasons. If for nothing else, it's a branch of the cathedral that I talked about.
Right.
So I'm not very keen on the ideology that gets pushed in that. And the university is creating a lot of very serious problems for our society right now. Our meritocracy is what's supposed to undergird our society and kind of properly order it, but it's very much so now all built on credentialism. And what the credentialism of the university has done, beyond indoctrinating people and stuff that I think is pretty dangerous, what it's also done is created a really bad model for social advancement. So what we do is we take people usually around like 18, and we say, okay, well, these would probably be like your prime, like finding a spouse or like making money years, or starting to build a life years. So what we're going to do is, instead of letting you like go get a job and form a family, we're going to put you in extended adolescence for an extra 4 years and put you $50 to $100,000 in debt. And so what happens is, a job, let's say, you know accountant, that would have required maybe some night courses and a little bit, and then like just working under someone like an apprenticeship 20 or 30 years ago, now requires a college degree. Even running something like a Target, like a big box store in America, requires a college degree. Again, something that a normal working class person would have been able to work their way up to if they just got started working at 18, now requires them to go deeply into debt. And so this has a couple of really negative effects. The first of which is you're much less likely to form families, because you're spending those years, that your parents spent like getting a home and having children. You're spending it going into debt and going to school. It also means that people are then much less able to get those jobs that they need, and that there's a number of different reasons for that, including labor markets being what they are. But one of the reasons is that everybody has to compete for these same jobs to pay back the debts that they've incurred through the college. They can't go out and buy homes because, again, they're working at these jobs to pay off these debts. And it really limits people's life opportunities, because they start life off basically with like what would have cost your parents a starter home, you now have in debt to get exactly the same kind of pay scale that they got when they were your age. And this is only getting worse, because now you're seeing things like bachelor's degrees don't even matter for the middle class. Now you have to go get a master's degree, go further into debt, delay family formation even longer. And I think these are pretty large disasters just by themselves, just as a structural issue, before you even get to what's being taught in the university.
Hmm. Yeah, that's you're very much mentioning a lot of the same points that very much worry me. I'd never actually considered the relationship between the debt and the buying a home and starting the family, and the trend that we're seeing with putting off starting a family and the subsequent lowering of the birth rate, which could come from the fact that women are waiting until 35 when they might not have that many good years left. Uh,
Yeah, yeah, I mean, how can they not, right? Like you got to pay off your loan, and you
yeah,
got to find a guy who has paid off something similar if you want to have a hope of, and then the child care becomes more competitive to pay for that kind of thing because any anybody who is trying to make these incomes to pay off these debts can't stay home with their child for the most part, and all these things feed into eroding that ability to build a family.
yeah. The problem is I don't really know what to suggest to any 18-year-olds. I don't think there are many watching this video based on my YouTube statistics, but I did have the privilege of advising a 19-year-old recently who wanted to do a master's degree. I tried to encourage him to just try to look for. He's an engineer. I'm an engineer as well, and he was interested in doing a master's degree, and I said, just go look for a job. You won't get more debt, and you'll actually be making money during that time. But uh, you know the trouble is that for an intelligent young person, university is the best place to make friends and to get involved in intellectual life. And the thought of telling a young person who is really enjoying their university work to tell them to go out there and make money and start the boring life as a parent and a spouse. I can't imagine that being convincing to anyone, and to be honest, I don't even know if I would even be able to advise that honestly.
Yeah, and I guess that's just in long term a shift of values, right? Like you can the the reason people think parenthood is boring is because in large part they've been told so, and every and I'm not saying every moment is the most exciting thing in the world, but where you place your value is going to determine what you think is going to be worth your time and investment young. I guess the problem is that you can kind of always go back and get a degree, but you might not always be able to go back and start a family. And most
Mm.
people assume that they can kind of just do both forever.
Well, I think the
But
assumption is that it's backwards, right? Where they go, "Oh, we can always," especially men who are fertile for much longer. People assume that, oh, I've got forever to have kids, but I need to get an education now so that I can get a good job, right off the bat. They don't want to work in a supermarket for 5 years before they get a degree and get a credentialed job.
yeah, and that this does actually hit women harder, like you said, because of the biology involved. And I guess at the end of the day, like you just have to think to yourself, like how fulfilled, how meaningful is my life because I stacked enough doctorates, or I created enough spreadsheets, or I
Mm,
prepared enough slideshows, right?
yeah.
And it's hard to tell people that because you're right that many of the best jobs are behind those walls. And I'm not even telling people don't necessarily go to college, but what I am saying is understand what that means, and understand that there's a larger systemic problem that is forcing you to make these choices, right? And like you shouldn't have to get the degree to get the very basic middle class job. That's not how this should work. You are required to, and that goes back to what we were talking about with kind of the clear pill and just checking out. The one of the problems is that the system is set up in a way where like if you want to get those jobs, you will need to do those things, and if you don't go through this system, then you will pay a price. And so if there isn't some collective action taken to fix that problem, then people suffer individually, which we see all around us as people get to their mid 30s and realize like, oh, I haven't really started life yet, and that clock is ticking. And so many people are finding themselves on the other side of that clock and saying, wow, I made some really bad choices and there's no way back to that now. So it is a larger societal problem that unfortunately will only get solved when society either faces it or things fall apart because they didn't. All the best we can do is make decisions having that knowledge.
Yeah, I think just coming back to what you said at the start about the choice that women make in particular, I think the other trouble that I would have with convincing any woman in particular not to go to university, if I were to do that, would be that these days university is very much where people go, whether intentionally or not, to find their future spouse. And for women in particular, there is no better place to find a man who can match you intellectually or surpass you than going to a university. And we don't have the same social structures that we used to have, where people can meet up, cross culture. I don't mean culturally. I mean, crossing social divides, so class divides, whereby intelligent young people could find each other maybe a little bit easier than they can now, just using Tinder or whatever they can use. University really does that quite nicely.
Yeah, and that's one of the big problems with your consensus making apparatus being things like university, right? Like being what, part of the cathedral, the point of the cathedral is everyone has to go, right?
Yeah.
Everyone has to go to church in the 1300s. That's where you meet people. That's where you meet your spouse. That's where you climb the social ladder. Well, where do you have to go now to do all those things? You go to the cathedral. It's just called a university, right? It still serves the same function. It just serves it it's just a different building that serves the same function. And you can actually see there, if you look at the work of Christopher Lasch and Charles Murray, are two people to read on this. They both make the point that what these colleges are doing is they're creating a separate set of elites. Because who actually goes to college? A lot of people will sit online talking politics and think of themselves as representative of the majority of people, but 2/3 of Americans don't get college degrees. The majority of people are not college educated. So when you say the best place for people to go for this, what we mean is the best place of people of a certain class, right? College is a class sorting mechanism. That doesn't mean that you don't get people from lower classes that end up going to college, but largely it's a place where people of a certain class get together and create romantic relationships and form families and that kind of thing. And what both Murray and Lasch talk about is because people increasingly meet in college, we are basically selecting for intelligence by drawing basically the smartest people in every community away from that community and towards an educational institution. And then those people who were able to get into the college, which is based on SATs, which is functionally an IQ test, those people get together and they're the ones that marry. And then they separate from society because they're the only ones who are the only people they're interacting with and marrying are now people of their cognitive status. And so because that's happening increasingly more and more, what we see is an elite culture that is separated out by this educational institution of people who get further pulled away from their communities and instead get pulled into what people often call the professional managerial class. A group of people who tend to all share the same values because, again, they all went to the same institutions. And you can see how this kind of wraps around into the cathedral is, these are all increasingly the people who rule us are people who only went to these things, and the people who have elite jobs, have higher level jobs and higher levels of pay are the people who went to these things and only married each other because they only interacted with people of that similar class cognitively. And this creates a serious disparity in both the earning potential and connection to, kind of the culture of the people from who's in charge to who actually lives in the country.
Coming back to your experience with university, just to quickly go through what it was like for me, I studied engineering, as I've already said. I try not to brag about it too much, but that was very politically neutral, aside from the environmentalist stuff, the technology that we sort of touched on, which could arguably be called political. There was no, as far as I can tell, there was no influence of what we call cathedral consensus ideas. But studying political science, I can imagine it would be very different for you. So I wonder if there's anything you have to say about that experience and whether it was good for you ultimately.
Yeah, so I'm a little older, and so I entered college at basically kind of just before the woke stuff hit, which didn't mean that colleges at that time weren't still very left wing. They were like 95% of my professors were very clearly left wing, if not approaching Marxist openly. But back then, I was seen as novel, as kind of I was the one conservative guy in the room people got to argue with. So professors were kind of happy to have me just because someone would actually speak up and bring the other side of the argument. And that didn't mean I never had professors say, hey, that's wrong, or, try to dissuade me from something. But it wasn't the crushing, like, you're never going to make it. You can't get a good grade in my class if you write, an essay with a wrong opinion, that type of thing. But it was definitely, like you said, it's political science class. There's no way you're going to avoid, having those political discussions. And they were certainly, very much a left-wing bias. But it was still more of an attitude of, well, let's have a discussion with you about it than let's crush you out of this, which is what you see more today.
But even having a discussion seems like they could have been setting you up to fail almost, even if unintentionally. If it was you against the whole room, including the teacher, and you're just a 21-year-old or whatever, it seems like it would be difficult to hold your own in a situation like that.
No, they will, and you'll get beaten. And don't get me wrong, at the end of the day, you're going to start making choices because you're going to say, okay, do I really want to say this? Do I really want to get into this today? Is this really want to go? Because you are talking to a tenured college professor who's read way more than you and thought about a lot of this way more than you, and so they're going to beat you publicly a number of times. I guess I'm just stubborn, and so I was the kind of person who was like, all right, I lost that, I need to figure out why. And that really encouraged me to go searching for much of that stuff more than it beat me down. But I also had a lot of people who would come up to me at the end of classes and be like, hey, I actually agree with you. Like, I'm not going to say anything out loud, but but I actually agree with you. And I remember skipping a philosophy class one day, and I actually had like 3 people from my philosophy class come over and find me, and they're like, there was a debate on this, and you weren't there today, and so nobody said anything, and we didn't know what to do because normally we just agree with you, and so there's no one to like disagree with the professor, and so like so most people are not going to do that, and I don't think that makes anything special about me. It's just the way I'm wired, But you can't count on that being the way most people are going to react to that situation.
Yeah,
because it won't be. Yeah,
I don't have a strong spirit like that. I've been trying to train myself to be a bit more like that because there is so much. I don't know how much it exists in the US, but here we have the phenomenon of the shy Tory, where people who vote Labour or Green or just more left wing in general, they feel very confident speaking their political opinions in public, and even when they say something that directly contradicts something I believe or that I know to be true, I still don't speak up about it because it's just too awkward. I just don't want to get into the conversation, and I'd really like to be. I don't think I'd get in trouble at work if I did that because there are a few people at work who are like that, but I just feel too shy about it. And
well, yeah, and to be fair, at work I don't do that because I very much have worked in arenas where I cannot. You might not have a hard time believing that like being a very right wing journalist probably doesn't get you a lot of friends in most publications. So I have played those games. Like, it's not that I go out there in every opportunity, and increasingly I don't. I find much of that can be unproductive. You really need a willing ear for most of that, and most people aren't going to be willing to hear those kind of things until you have a personal relationship with them. Like, most people do not have their minds changed because one day they stumbled upon a complete stranger who came out and gave them the hard facts and logic, the Ben Shapiro pitch. And then all of a sudden they're like, you were right the whole time, and I'm going to discard all these deeply held beliefs that
Yeah.
everyone I know has because you hit me with the facts and logic. I don't think that's how people work at all. In fact, that's exactly what I say with neo-reactionary stuff. That's not how politics works. That's not how people work at all. So the only way you really change people's minds is through personal contact for the most part. And so those are the people I usually have those conversations with, not random coworkers who are just going to, not listen or worse.
I have a few things to say about how to change people's minds and persuasion, and it's a topic I've given a lot of thought to, and I've got a lot to say about my own experience of changing my mind about political subjects. But to be honest, I don't even want to get into that because I don't think changing people's minds is necessarily the best approach, even just to think about it that way. I'm more concerned with the sort of the humiliation of it, just it wears you down not being true to yourself, not nodding along with something that you shouldn't nod along with. And it goes for politics, and I think it goes for, a lot of things. If you hear if a bunch of people are bad-mouthing one of your friends, but there's more of them and you don't want to stand up for them, and it's, it's demoralizing. And I guess that's part of why I'd like to be more assertive. And just to bring up an example, I posted it on Twitter when my boss, who I'm quite friendly with, and he probably would have a conversation with me, but he randomly during a conversation asserted that Donald Trump believes that the Earth is 6,000 years old, and he said it with a bit of a smile. So I don't know if he sincerely believed that or if he was just saying it as a joke or what, but I know that's not true. Although, to be honest, I didn't know for certain that Trump doesn't think that, but I'm pretty sure he doesn't think that, or that he's not on record saying that. But what do you say? I mean, he's just making a dumb joke, and then if I go, well, actually, Snopes said that the PolitiFact said that that's not true. It's like I've just randomly diverted the conversation away from whatever we were talking about down this tangent that this guy brought up, and it's easier just to nod along. But I think about that moment for the rest of the day because it's embarrassing,
Yeah, well, the thing to understand there is what he's actually doing is just calling Trump a heretic, right? Like it's not an actual critique of Trump's reason. And this is a trap a lot of people fall into. Like, I hear this from people all the time. Like, Trump is anti-science. Well, what does that even mean? Like, do you think he doesn't think like gravity exists? Like, he doesn't believe in magnetism? Like, what do you mean by that? And usually it just means he doesn't adhere to the cultural status markers I find valuable, right? Like, I have a very particular set of beliefs about what makes somebody worthy, and because he doesn't conform to them, he must not agree with anything that I agree with. So he doesn't like science, TM, And this is why you see progressives cling to things like science denial, so fervently, is what they're really just doing is yelling heretic at people. Like, you don't believe in the gospel, and so therefore you should be shunned. Now, it doesn't enter into their brains at any point that the party of science, the people of science, can't tell the difference between a man and a woman, something that, people 4,000 years ago could do just fine. You find too complex to understand, but you believe in science. But none of that matters because that's not really what it's about. It's a team marker. It's not an actual critique of someone's position.
Yeah, I absolutely. I think you're right about that, and you use a lot of language there that's very enlightening. Puts a name to these phenomena in a useful way. Phenomena, excuse me, and I guess these vague criticisms, these vague labels like anti-science, I completely agree with you on that. But there is something that's far more irritating to me, at least, about like specific factual claims that just aren't true. And I think there's a good reason why the term fake news is taken off, where it's just there are people make these claims usually for political reasons that they just heard someone else say. You know, that they heard someone else say that Trump is the young Earth creationist, and it fit with their picture of what Trump is because he's anti-science or whatever. So then they'll just say it, and they don't care if it's true or not. They won't look up whether he said it. It just makes sense. He would say something like that, so I'll just say it. And it's, you know, it's true. And I've been that person in the past. I don't do it anymore, or I try not to. But that's what really bugs me, is that the actual specific factual claims that are just fake news. Somebody down the line, either maliciously or just out of negligence, said something that was false, and then it just became news. You know what I mean?
Yeah, and actually, do you mind if we wrap up after I answer this, because my wife needs to come? Yeah, yeah, let me answer that, and then we can talk after. But I just need to not be recording. She's got to do things in the background.
All right.
But yes, to answer that, what you're saying there. So here's the thing about fake news. What we have with fake news is a breakdown again of our consensus making apparatus. And the problem is that, like, if we can't trust our news sources and we can't trust our universities and our educational systems because we believe they have ulterior motives that are not in our interest, then our basic frame of discussion breaks down, because we are our institutions. We all make reference to them. How do I know what's happening in the UK? Because the news tells me, right? Like, I'm not going to the UK. I don't know. Like, I might talk to you. I might talk to my buddy who was there a few months ago. But that's only because I happen to have a few connections. For the most part, the vast majority of people are going to have no clue what's happening. And you look at a country like America, we're a continent-wide country. If you live on the East Coast, what do you know about California? What do you know about Seattle? You only know what's on the news, right? So if the informational apparatus that delivers those things to you is corrupted, then it breaks down almost all conversations, because they stop being about discussing what's happening in a factual sense, and they basically just become doubting each other's sources, right? Well, I saw on MSNBC that there was a riot, and Black Lives Matter and Antifa were burning down buildings. Well, I saw that the Proud Boys were marching through the streets, and they were the ones agitating everybody. What really happened? Who knows? Were any of us there? No, right? So we're increasingly, because our consensus making apparatus is broken, we are then required to simply rely on alternatives. And there's no way for us to have those conversations where, like, we can actually have a agreed set of facts that will allow us to solve that problem. And that's why you see the culture tearing the way it does. And it's not even necessarily geographically. It's often, one house over, you've got someone who is completely different from you because they trust a source that you don't trust, and you guys can't talk to each other because there's literally no shared institution for you guys to fall back on and actually have a discussion with the same information.
Yeah, absolutely. There's so much there that rings true. And Scott Adams calls it the phenomenon of the whole room is watching the same screen and sitting two different movies. You get the impression that the people around you are seeing the same thing as you, when actually you're not. And as soon as you try to actually have a conversation about it, you run into this exact problem you're describing, where you can't agree on the facts, and so the conversation goes nowhere.
Yeah, and unfortunately, I know a lot of people are like, well, how do we fix that? And the answer is we probably don't, which is really disturbing for a lot of people, I understand. But, how do two people who have completely different basis for reality solve that? And the answer is probably not talking about it, which is unfortunate. But I do not see one side. The only way this changes is if one side yields to the other's source of truth, right? Source of claims of knowledge. And increasingly, I think it's harder and harder to see that happening.
Yeah, okay. Well, although that may be a bleak note to end on, I think we'll end it there. And I was aiming for an hour, so thank you very much for staying for an hour and a half.
Oh no, absolutely. It's been a great discussion. I appreciate you having me.
Well, thank you very much for coming on, and I hope that everyone watching will go and check out your channel and maybe subscribe and leave a comment saying that I sent you. And by you, I mean the person watching, not you, Auron. Am I pronouncing that right? I told you how
Yes,
to.
yes, you got it right.
And what
Yep.
is it, Irish or is it a made up fantasy name?
It's a yeah, it's a mashup of different names
Mm,
for my moniker, but
I like it. You
I
know,
appreciate it. Thank you.
whenever people talk about YouTube, I always try to advise them to pick a name that's easy to spell, and yours is unique so that it's sort of Googleable, but it's easier to remember how to spell it. So it's great in that respect. So well done for that.
Yeah, thanks. I wanted to be able to write under it, and so that was why I did it that way. Yeah.
Oh, that's great. And yeah, have a good day to you and to everyone watching.
All right, thanks, guys. Bye.